The opening hook, the impossible year. It began not with the defiant boom of cannons in 1776, nor the hopeful arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, but with a silent, desperate bet on a marshy riverbank in 1607, a bet that humanity should have lost. Forget the tidy textbooks. American history is not a predictable march of progress. It is a sprawling saga of spectacular failure, improbable luck, and an unending, often brutal conflict over who truly belonged on this soil and who would control the narrative. This story begins with a death count that would make any modern general blanch, a dark, almost fantastical period that set the stage for the audacious superpower the world knows today. We travel back to the first year of Jamestown, 1607 to 1608. Of the 104 colonists who stepped off those three small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, more than half were dead within 6 months. By the time the first supply ships arrived, only 38 miserable souls remained. This wasn't colonization. It was a mass grave masked as an investment. They were gentlemen, goldsmiths, and lazy adventurers, completely unprepared for the reality of the new world, malaria, hostile environments, and their own incompetence. But here is the truly astonishing part. They stayed. Why? Because the idea of America, the lure of wealth and escape, was already more powerful than the visceral reality of death. That suicidal resilience, that stubborn refusal to give up on a flawed, impossible project, is the very core of the American DNA. This is the hidden history of the next 423 years, a story built not on perfect virtue, but on an endless cycle of brilliant invention and profound moral compromise, all driven by that foundational, almost irrational obstinance. Part 1. The Genesis of Compromise, 1602 to 1783. The Two Pillars of Early America, 1602 to 1619. The true origin story of America is a simultaneous, conflicting arrival. In the same decade that the fragile settlements in Virginia were struggling to find gold, the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois Confederacy, were already operating one of the most sophisticated democracies in the world, with a constitution, the great law of peace, centuries old. This is a critical and often omitted counterpoint. While Europeans were dying in swamps, clinging to autocratic ideas, an indigenous federation was thriving on consensus, balance of power, and decentralized government. The collision of these two worldviews, one hierarchical and the other communal, defined the continent. The year 1619 is the definitive inflection point. It's famous for two monumental contradictory events that lay bare the American contradiction. The first, meeting of a representative assembly, the House of Burgesses, in Virginia, a revolutionary step toward self-government. The second, the arrival of the first enslaved Africans at Point Comfort, a foundational crime that established the economic engine of the South. From this moment, America was born with a fatal structural flaw. The belief in self-rule and freedom was inextricably linked to and economically dependent upon the denial of both to an entire race of people. The Forgotten Century, 1689 to 1763. The 18th century is not just a prelude to the Revolution, it's a crucible of global power. The colonists were subjects of a vast British Empire, locked in a nearly continuous second 100 Years' War with France. The local conflicts in North America, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, were merely colonial theaters in massive European struggles. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, known in America as the French and Indian War, is the true catalyst for American independence. Why? Because the colonists, for the first time, fought alongside British regulars and saw their own competence. They realized that the British military, though powerful, was not invincible, and that the British officers held them in contempt. Surprising fact: George Washington's first military command ended in failure and surrender at Fort Necessity in 1754, an inauspicious start to his legend. When the British won and expelled the French, the need for British protection vanished. To pay for the war, Parliament started imposing taxes, Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, prompting the colonists to invoke the very rights they had learned to cherish. The cry of no taxation without representation was not just about money, it was about respect and sovereignty, a direct result of their newfound confidence gained in a global war. The Revolution and its unfinished business, 1776 to 1783. The Revolutionary War was won by audacity and an impossible alliance. It was far from inevitable. Surprising fact, the Continental Army was often closer to mutiny than victory. At Valley Forge, more soldiers died of disease and starvation than in any battle. The currency was worthless. Had the British not been distracted by a global war with France, Spain, and the Netherlands, the American cause likely would have failed. The crucial turning point was the Battle of Saratoga, 1777, which convinced France to formally ally with the U.S. and provide the navy, money, and professional troops like Lafayette that were essential for the final victory at Yorktown in 1781. The resulting peace established the United States, but it immediately exposed the fatal contradictions established in 1619. The Declaration's assertion that all men are created equal became the ultimate aspirational hypocrisy, leaving the nation with 3 enormous unresolved debts: slavery, codified and strengthened by the Constitution's 3/5 compromise; indigenous sovereignty, the vast land west of the Appalachians was now American, setting the stage for decades of conflict and forced removal; and the right to vote, restricted overwhelmingly to white male property owners, postponing true democracy for centuries.
The Age of Jefferson and the Great Bargain, 1803 to 1830. The early republic was defined by an aggressive push westward. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803, bought from a cash-strapped Napoleon, doubled the size of the nation overnight, a stunning transaction executed by a president, Jefferson, who wasn't sure he had the constitutional authority to do it. This westward movement was fueled by a concept known as manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely ordained to spread across the entire continent. This idea was a noble mask for a brutal reality: the displacement and genocide of Native American nations, epitomized by the forced march of the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, 1830s, a direct result of President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. The Irrepressible Conflict, 1850 to 1865. The structural flaw of 1619, the contradiction of freedom and enslavement, finally tore the nation apart. The Civil War was not simply about states' rights. It was, as Lincoln clearly stated, about slavery's expansion and perpetuity. The surprising fact was that the first shots were fired not at Fort Sumter, but arguably in Bleeding, Kansas in the mid-1850s, a localized civil war over whether the new territory would be free or slave. The war was a slaughterhouse that redefined modern conflict. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all other American wars combined from the Revolution through Vietnam. It established the industrial scale of war, the necessity of mass conscription, and the political power of a strong central government. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, was a brilliant military and political stroke. It freed slaves only in the Confederate States, thus enabling them to flee and join the Union cause, starving the South of labor and bolstering the North's ranks. It formally linked the cause of the Union with the moral imperative of abolishing slavery. Reconstruction's betrayal, 1865 to 1877. The decade following the Civil War was arguably the nation's most radical and hopeful experiment in democracy. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship to all persons born in the U.S., including former slaves, and secured voting rights for black men. In the South, a fleeting period of radical Reconstruction saw black men elected to Congress and state offices. However, this dream was ruthlessly suppressed by white supremacist paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan and undermined by a weary Northern public and Supreme Court rulings that chipped away at the new amendments. The formal end came with the Compromise of 1877, a shocking political deal. In exchange for the Republican presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes winning a contested election, the federal government agreed to pull the last Union troops out of the South. This effectively handed control of the region back to white segregationists, leading to the establishment of Jim Crow laws that would institutionalize racial oppression for another.
Part 3. Industrial Might and Progressive Turmoil, 1878 to 1945. The Rise of the Titans, 1880 to 1910. The Gilded Age, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and the astonishing, ruthless industrial transformation. Surprising details on labor struggles, the rise of unions, and the massive European immigration waves that fundamentally changed the demographics of major cities. The Progressive Era's Ambivalence, 1900 to 1920. Theodore Roosevelt's trust-busting and conservationism versus the continued political disenfranchisement of women until the 19th Amendment, and the rise of eugenics movements. The Great War and the Roaring Twenties, 1914 to 1929. America's isolationism, its decisive entry into World War I, and the immediate, painful retreat into nativism and the moral rigidity of Prohibition. The cultural explosion of the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance. The trauma of Depression and the New Deal, 1929 to 1941. The utter collapse of the economy, FDR's revolutionary expansion of the federal government through Social Security, the CCC, and other programs, a permanent shift in the social contract. World War II and the birth of a superpower, 1941 to 1945. The necessity of the alliance with the Soviet Union, the domestic sacrifice, the internment of Japanese Americans, a moral stain, and the secret Manhattan Project, ending with the terrifying new reality of the atomic age. Part 4. The Cold War and Civil Rights Revolution, 1946 to 1991. The Atomic Anxiety and the Suburban Dream, 1946 to 1960. The rise of the suburbs, facilitated by the GI Bill and mass-produced housing. The economic boom and the paradox of the Cold War's pervasive fear. McCarthyism and the dark side of ideological conformity. The Moral Crucible, 1954 to 1968. The Civil Rights Movement. MLK, Rosa Parks, and the nonviolent revolution against Jim Crow. The surprising role of television in exposing Southern brutality to the national audience. The passage of the landmark Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Vietnam and the Crisis of Confidence, 1960 to 1975. The long, complex failure in Southeast Asia. The anti-war movement, the counterculture, and the deep, permanent fracture of trust between the American people and their government. The Pentagon Papers. Stagnation and the Reagan Revolution, 1970 to 1989. Economic stagflation and the energy crisis. The rise of political conservatism, the promise of smaller government, and the massive buildup that defined the final years of the Cold War. The unexpected triumph, 1989 to 1991. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. America stands alone as the world's sole superpower. a moment of global victory that masked growing domestic issues. Part 5. The New Millennium and the Digital Age, 1992 to 2025. The Digital Dawn and the Post-Cold War Peace, 1992 to 2001. The Internet's commercial explosion, the economic boom of the late 90s, and the brief period of relative geopolitical calm known as the end of history. The rise of globalization and the outsourcing of American industry. The Forever Wars, 2001 to 2011. The shock of 9/11 and the immediate, profound shift in national priorities. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Patriot Act, and the expansion of the surveillance state. The surprising resilience and enduring cost of counterterrorism efforts. The Great Recession and cultural fragmentation, 2008 to 2020. The financial crisis that exposed the fragility of the economic system. The rise of social media as both a tool for collective action and a platform for ideological polarization. The increasing focus on identity, equity, and the long-delayed reckoning with the structural racism rooted in 1619. The current moment, 2020 to 2025. The global pandemic as a shock test for American infrastructure and unity. The rapid acceleration of technological change, AI, renewable energy, space exploration, and the intense political and social polarization over the nation's core values. A return to the foundational conflict of who America is for and what its ideals truly mean. The story would conclude by circling back to the original premise that the American saga is not one of flawless victory, but of a unique, almost suicidal resilience. From the 38 survivors in the Jamestown swamp to the complex, divided superpower of today, the nation's 423 years have been defined by its stubborn refusal to fail, its boundless capacity for reinvention, and its perpetual internal struggle to finally live up to the impossible promise it made to itself in 1776.